Hello everyone, this is Orlando from A Collector's Dream. And today I want to talk about an article that I saw in the Sports Collectors Daily. And really, if anybody wants to know about vintage college football, or really vintage football, because there was no NFL back in the day, this is a beautiful, incredible article that talks a lot about the history and what happened back in the day, how it was, and it talks about the old football cards. And I'll share some cards that I have here along with the article. But it's a great article. I'll put a link to it here. It was by Rich Muller. And, it talks about how the sport was much different in the earlier days. It says, in the late 19th century, American football was a brutal, unregulated spectacle dominated by college teams where broken bones, concussions, and even fatalities were part of the game. The rough nature of the game birthed not only modern rules, but also the first dedicated football cards. And the first football cards were these. The not the Mayo Cup plug. This was the first set, but this was the first card that I'll share in a minute here. But this was the first set produced. It says, while the 1894 Mayo Cup plug tobacco has long been celebrated as the first issued devoted exclusively to the sport, deeper historical dives reveal an even early pioneer. Yet the Mayo set stands as the genesis of college football players and trading cards by immortalizing Ivy League stars and fierce rivalries. For collectors with a passion for pre-war rarities, these early issues and their successors offer a tangible link to football's formative years. So it says, let's delve into the historical context, the pioneering cards, their extensions into the 20th century, including other sets with college players, a spotlight on New Rockne appearances, and a nod to the influential 1955 Topps All-American. So it talks about some of the earlier times in the sport, which basically was three teams that dominated. It was Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. And this was the first big match, Harvard and Yale. And it says, football's American roots trace back to 1869, when Rutgers defeated Princeton 6-4. What is considered the first intercollegiate game, a chaotic blend of soccer and rugby rules played with 25 players per side. You can imagine 25 players per side. That's really crazy. Let me get a drink of water here. You can imagine how brutal it was. By the 1870s and 80s, the sport had exploded in popularity among the northeastern colleges, particularly the Ivy League elites, Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. These institutions formed the Big Three, whose annual clashes drew massive crowds and fueled intense rivalries that persist today. The Harvard-Yale game, dubbed The Game, began in 1875 and quickly became a social event for the elite, while Princeton-Yale matchups often decided informal national championships. There really weren't formal national championships back then. It was still very, very relatively new league. It says this rivalry even inspired some of the earliest trade cards. Though many were generic illustrations rather than depictions of real players promoting tobacco or other goods with team-themed imagery. Yet this golden age was shadowed by violence, without helmets, padding, or forward passes. And passes were introduced in 1906. Games devolved into brutal scrums. In 1894 alone, the year that the focal card set, the Mayo Cup plug set came out, 18 players died from injuries nationwide, prompting calls from figures like President Theodore Roosevelt to ban the sport entirely. Here's a ticket of the Yale-Harvard game back from 1894. So I'm not going to go through the whole article. I'm just going to go a little bit more and show some cards. Rivalries amplified the ferocity. The 1894 Harvard-Yale game, for instance, was so vicious that it was suspended for 2 years due to excessive roughness. Southern schools like Georgia Tech and Georgia added their own heated contests, such as the 1893 game marred by a train wreck and rout, sparking the clean, old-fashioned hate rivalry. Even border states like Kansas and Missouri saw games intertwined with Civil War grudges, evolving into border war. Amid this chaos, tobacco companies saw the opportunity to market to young fans, inserting cards into products to promote brands and celebrate these college heroes. First was the True Pioneer, and that was 1888, the N162 Goodwin champions. And in that set was Harry Beecher, the first football card ever. And Harry Beecher was the captain of the Yale football team and the star back in those days. It says, before the Mayo set of the 1890s, the 1888 N162 Goodwin champion issue produced by Goodwin and Company for their Old Judge and Gypsy Queen cigarette brands introduced the hobby's first football card depicting an American football player. This 50-card multi-sport set featured athletes from various disciplines, but card number 4 showcased Yale quarterback and captain Harry Beecher. So it's often listed as Henry Beecher in his football uniforms, complete with a quilted jacket, nose guard, and you see the size of that football, almost like a rugby ball. Beecher, born in 1867, led Yale to an undefeated 1888 season, scoring a then record 66 points and helping secure a national championship. So he was the first big star, the captain of Yale, the first football card ever, and really it's considered, by some to be similar to the Honus Wagner, and it says it here. The card's hand-colored lithograph design with a white border and Champions banner, the banner is on the back of the card, it says Champions, captured the era's amateur spirit and growing professionalism debates. Rarity defines this card. Just over 100 are graded examples exist. And it says, often called the Honus Wagner of football, it predates dedicated sets and ties directly to Yale's dominance in the Big Three rivalries. For collectors, it's the cornerstone of pre-war football, blending scarcity and historical significance. So that was the first set, the first football card ever produced. And he was the biggest star of the day, Beecher, the Yale captain. Again, scored 66 points in one season, led Yale to an undefeated season, and so on. But the landmark 1894 Mayo Cup plug set, the N302, building on Beecher's solidarity appearance on the 1894 Mayo Cup plug set, cataloged as the N302, emerged as the first trading card issue devoted exclusively to American football. They were issued by P.H. Mayo and Brother of Richmond, Virginia. It comprised of 35 cards measuring 1 5/8 by 2 7/8. They were sepia-tone cards and photographs of actual players from Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. Set them on a stark black borders with the player's name and the small Mayo Cup plug advertisement at the bottom. They were distributed in tins of chewing tobacco, and they were non-sport. They were really the first football cards ever made. The checklet highlights stars of the day, including Harvard's W.C. Mackey and Yale's Frank Hinkie. So here's Hinkie. He was one of the big stars of the day, along with Mackey. And I'll talk a little bit about Mackey in a little bit. He was the other stars, along with the anonymous card, who actually was one of the biggest stars of the day. And that's the set's crown jewel. It says, but the set's crown jewel is the ultra rare anonymous card. And there's a copy of the anonymous card depicting Harvard's John Dunlop without a name. And Dunlop was the star of Harvard, while Mackey, was also played for Harvard. Some of the other stars were Princeton and Yale. And you can see that Poe is another one of the big names in the set. Poe was not one of the big players, but he was Edgar Allan Poe's nephew. So it's a popular card. And so it says that the anonymous card was literally removed from the printing process due to the printing error, where you can see there was no name of the player. And that's why it was called the anonymous card. Only a handful of Dunlop examples are known to exist, with one discovered in a New Jersey attic in 1994 and another in a farmhouse in 2012. And again, I've shown my Beecher card, and I also have the anonymous card, which really, to me, is the Honus Wagner of football cards. It's only a handful known to exist, probably less than 10. And these cards reflect the sport's raw essence, players in quilted pants, nose guards, embodying the era's immigrant influence rosters and amateur ideals. Even as debates over player payments simmered in the early 1890s, for collectors, the set scarcity makes it a holy grail, tying directly to football's brutal, rivalry-driven origins. So it goes on to talk a little bit more about the Mayo set. It goes on to talk about the Sports King set, the National Chickle set, and so on and so on. So it's a great article. I encourage you guys to go back and read that. I'll put a link to it on the description of this video. But I'm going to move on a little bit to show you a little bit about the Mackey. But before I get to that, it talks a little bit about after that era. It says that following the Mayo set, there really weren't any cards. It says that in the early 1900s, they were dominated by mixed sets, such as cultural cachets of the Ivy here and postcards. It says postcards from this era often featured real college athletes, and it talks about the 1908 postcards, which were generic scenes, or postcards from the teams. So I'll go ahead and show you, and I've shared some of these postcards already in the past, but some of the postcards back in those days were postcards like this of Harvard in 1909. So again, no cards were produced, between 1894, no sets, all the way up to the Sports Kings and the Chickle sets, other than postcards and some various other scenes. So this is a sample of the 1909 Tupper postcard of the Harvard team with real photos of the real players that played for the teams. And I've also shown these in an earlier video. You can go back and watch those. This is the Princeton team from the 1907, the Kugler Company postcard, also showing some of the actual players. A lot of these are college football Hall of Famers like Coy and Conklin and Bulow, and you can go back and look at the video that I did on these. And again, postcards were the only way to get these type of cards back in the day. And this is the Princeton postcard from the Princeton team with real photographs of the actual players back in those days. And by this time, they already started doing forward pass. I'm gonna drink of water, guys. So, wanted to show you one of the stars from the 1894 Mayo plug cards was Mackey. And Mackey was really one of the Harvard stars. He was an All-American football player and coach. He served as head coach for the Baldwin College. And, Mackey became a football All-American in 1894. He won championship in 1895. And he led the Harvard Crimson football team from 1891 to 1894. Before his first season with the team, Walter Camp described Mackey as strong and active, knows what is required of him in both offense and defense, particularly in the latter, and would steady up Harvard's center more than any other man that could be selected. So, Walter Camp, which really is the kind of the legend, the one that kind of started football, the most famous football coach ever, said that Mackey was the head of the team, especially the defensive guy. And back in those days, the game was mostly defense. By then they already had less players in every team. They had 11 players per team, per offense and defense. So it wasn't like it was way in the past. But Mackey started his sophomore year at center, but he moved to right guard before the 1892 Harvard-Yale game due to an injury. Mackey remained at right guard in 1893, and the other player, Matt Acton, moved to left guard. Mackey was named to the 1894 College Football All-American team, and again, he's in the College Football Hall of Fame. And he, again, was one of the best players from the day. And I'll share another picture of Mackey here. And this is the Harvard trio. And there's Mackey right there. As you can see, he was a big, strong guy in those days, He was one of the big guys. And, just one of those guys, big, strong guys. So here's the Mackey card from the Mayo Cup plug. There's a total of PSA graded, only 16 of these cards graded by PSA. And you can see Mackey there in his Harvard uniform. And it says Mackey, Harvard, and the Mayo Cup plug. What I love about these cards is the back is black. And again, this one was stuck on an album. And even though it says minimum size not met, these cards were very just cut by hand, so they weren't all very well cut. But I want to share the Mackey card. I want to share that article and a little bit about some of the pre-war football, 19th century football. So if you're interested in this kind of stuff like I am, go back and read this article. I'll put a link to it. But I just kind of wanted to share some of my Mayo Cup plug cards. And if you want to go back and check some of my other ones, I do have the Anonymous, I do have the Beecher, and I put those in earlier videos. But great stuff, interesting stuff. I love this kind of history. I'd love to go back and read about these players, because this was really one of the, men. These guys were men. They played tough, broken bones, many died, and, it's not like today's game that these guys barely can be touched. Back in those days, they just put their bodies out there and just did whatever they had to do to win those games. So thanks for watching, guys. This is Orlando from A Collector's Dream. Have an awesome, awesome day, and I'll catch you on the next one.